Hi, Rogue Reader here for another first reading review. This time I'm going to be looking at Reign of the Empire, Mask of Fear. This book was released, I think, back in February. So again, I've been playing catch up with some of the newer books. This is the first in what I believe is supposed to be a trilogy from Alexander Freed. It essentially covers it stars Mon Mothma and Bail Organa and a couple other characters in just shortly after the events of Revenge of the Sith, and it's about them dealing with the fallout of the fall of the Republic and how they have to deal with the new rise of the Empire, just kind of in those very first early days. I should say I have read Alexander Freed's other Star Wars books, Battlefront Twilight Company, I think he did the Rogue One novelization and the Alphabet Squadron trilogy, and I enjoyed all of those. So I was definitely looking forward to this one when it came out. So I'm not going to go into heavy spoilers, I'm just going to go into the basic setup first of what the novel is, just kind of the idea of this book. But like I mentioned, it does take place shortly after Revenge of the Sith, and really this is the story of Bail and Mon and a couple other characters, and how they're dealing with the fact that the Republic is now gone and now there's an empire in its place. And they're both trying to do things to either limit the Emperor's power or find a way to expose him for who he is. And there's not really this isn't a rebellion origin story. Not really. This is more just them kind of reacting to that fallout and how they have to deal with that, what they do, what they decide to do following that, how they feel about that mentally. There's a lot of politics, a lot of talking. That's really kind of the idea of this book. This isn't necessarily an action-heavy book. There is action in it, but this is definitely much more of a sort of political ideas, them talking, figuring out what to do in this new regime. It's essentially how this book works. Now, obviously, most people nowadays are probably more familiar. They probably would think of this as almost an Andor tie-in in a way, because I think most people have really gotten to know Mon Mothma's character, even Bail Organa more through Andor and how you see how they play things behind the scenes. But I would say this is much more of a follow-up to the deleted scenes in Revenge of the Sith. If you didn't know, there are deleted scenes in that movie that featured Padme had a little bit more of a subplot in that movie where she meets with Mon Mothma and Bail Organa, and they kind of begin the foundations of what will become the Rebel Alliance. They form this thing called the Delegation of 2000, where they're basically signing this petition opposing all the power Palpatine's had, and they're hoping that with all these 2,000 representatives that have signed it, it'll kind of force him to start to relinquish power, or take notice of the fact that people aren't very happy with the fact that he has all this power he's amassed. It's just 3 deleted scenes. The movie would have, I think, been better if they had stayed in. They're in the novelization too. But this book definitely, I mean, it's clear that those still happened, even though we don't see them in the movie, because this book references the Delegation of 2000 as well. So again, it's a follow-up to that, but it's also very much in the spirit of kind of what you see in Andor and such, and that more political, intense type kind of atmosphere. That's what you're really getting with this book. So I want to talk about the characters next and kind of how they relate to the plot. It's very connected. And I should mention that Alexander Freed, he has a way of writing characters that's it's very hard to describe for me. There's a disconnect with his characters that I find myself having, because typically the characters in his novels, they have something that has happened in their backstory, something traumatic usually, and they don't like to talk about it or share those experiences, but it does shape who they are. So typically you'll have this team of characters, and we know who those characters are because we're reading about them. We get to read their inner thoughts, but they don't necessarily know a lot about each other. They don't ever really share with each other what's happened. So it creates this strange sort of disconnect where you know a lot about the characters, but the characters that are part of this team that you would expect are supposed to kind of work together and get along, they don't necessarily know a lot about each other. So yeah, it kind of creates a strange feeling when you're reading it. And this book, I mean, it doesn't have that quite as much, I didn't find. Mon Mothma she does tend to keep things to herself a lot, and she doesn't share a lot. But Bail Organa is definitely much more of an open book much more optimistic and willing to talk about things. And one of the other characters in this book I really like, who I'll talk about shortly, Sujin, he's also very closed off and has a lot in his past, but he actually does open up at moments. So this book doesn't quite have that quite as much as his other novels do. Now, Mon Mothma, her part in this is that essentially one of the plot threads of this book is that they're going to have this reintegration day where they're going to bring the separatists back into the empire. So which is interesting, is like what happened to them. They're getting brought back in, and their senators are getting brought back in. She wants to pass a bill that will essentially limit Palpatine's power and keep the power with the senators. That's her plan for this. And basically, she's trying to throw together a coalition with these separatist senators coming back in the hopes of passing this bill that will limit Palpatine's power. That's kind of her plan and her strategy for dealing with this. I think she is written very well. She comes across as you would expect her, as the sides we've seen of her in Andor. We see that here, and I think she's written very well and on character from what we've seen. She does have some traumatic events. She was essentially kind of taken in by the Empire shortly after Revenge of the Sith, kind of as a warning, and some traumatic things happened to her mentally there, and she's dealing with that. So again, she's very guarded, but she's also determined to get done what she can, and her ideas are essentially, she still thinks she can limit this power and preserve democracy some way legally. She still thinks that's the path forward for her. Then you have Bail Organa, who's one of the other characters, and his strategy is different. We find out that Palpatine essentially released these recordings that showed the Jedi were plotting to overthrow him, and it paints them in a really bad light. And Bail is convinced these are doctored recordings. So his subplot in the book is essentially he is trying to find out who could have doctored these recordings, and if he can bring that to light, his thoughts are that he can exonerate the Jedi, and there will be this public outrising against Palpatine for making all this up, and that's what he can do to essentially stop Palpatine in his power. This ends up putting him on a collision course with Saw Gerrera, who we've seen in multiple media now, Rogue One, Clone Wars, Rebels, Andor. It puts him on a collision course with him, so we do get to see Saw and what he's doing at the very beginning of this period. And then we meet, there is a new character who I think is the best character in the book. His name is Sujin, and he's this former separatist kind of weapon. He's been genetically modified to be this agent assassin. His job was to go after targets during the war, and he's also kind of a backup if the separatists were to fail. He's kind of there to take out targets either in revenge or find a way to bring the separatists back. So he gets reactivated, and he's kind of... There's this idea that everyone is kind of stuck in their ways and no one's adapted. Bail is still clinging to the Jedi. Mon Mothma is still clinging to the idea that she can change things with legislation. And then we have Sujin, who wakes up in this new world, and he's still clinging to the idea that even though the separatists are gone, that he somehow has to take revenge against them or figure out... purely he just wants to kind of avenge what they've done and do damage. And even though they're gone, so he's stuck in his ways too. So that's kind of a theme of this book. Everyone has to learn, everyone has to adapt, or if they don't adapt, they're done. Basically, that's kind of the theme, one of the major themes of this book. And I think he's a very interesting character. I like following him. I like seeing his thought process, how he's interacting kind of in this new world and interacts with the other main characters. I found that all very interesting, and he was definitely my favorite part of the novel. There are a couple other characters in here, and I didn't find their stories as interesting. There's this Imperial agent who goes with Bail. She kind of has her own side agenda. And then there's one of her students who's infiltrating these kind of pro-Palpatine protesters. And those were okay, but I didn't find those plot threads to be anywhere near as interesting as what was going on with the main characters, Bail, Mon, and Sujin. But the book doesn't focus on them. I think it does give more of the attention to the main characters, which is nice. And I don't recall even though the other characters weren't as interesting, I didn't really find that they ever overstay their welcome either. As I mentioned, this book really gives off Andor vibes. It's very political. It's meant to be kind of have a lot of tense situations. I don't find it as tense as a lot of what happens in Andor, though. So it's really more of just kind of that political speak. It's really more of just kind of getting across those ideas and how they're reacting to everything changing. There is tension there, but I don't find it quite even though I think this takes a page from kind of following what Andor was trying to do in book form, I never found it quite as tense. But that's kind of what you would be, that's what you should expect going into this if that's something you wanted to read. Really, the plot is just a vessel here for the characters to either grow or not. That's really what the plot of this is. So what I liked about this novel, I really liked Sujin as a new character. He's really great. I like seeing these characters that we're familiar with and how they had to deal with the fallout of the Republic and the immediate aftermath. I think that is interesting to see, and how different they are when it comes to approaching that. Again, we're not quite approaching the origin of the rebellion yet. I would say this is more of a reaction to, they haven't quite got to the planning yet. They're in the reaction phase still, and I do like all of that. There's also a really cool new planet in this book that I just think is a great idea. It's this planet that's had this civilization that's been extinct since the Republic has been formed, but the wreckage of their buildings is still there. So you kind of have this ghost city that no one knows who the inhabitants were like, because they were long gone before the Republic was barely forming. And sometimes there's still equipment in the city that will go off. So there'll be scenes where they'll get these like transmissions in this alien language that's from some transmitter that's still going off after all these thousands of years. And it's almost as if like the ghosts are talking to them of the civilization in the city. And that's really interesting, and I enjoyed that. In terms of my dislikes, again, it's really, I didn't care for the other characters outside of the main three. I think this book paints Saw Gerrera as a main character. I wouldn't quite call him a main character. We don't get much from he's around, but we don't get much from his perspective as we do from the others. So anyone outside of the main ones, I didn't quite care for. I didn't quite care for their subplots as much. And also, I would say this is a book you have to be in the mood for. Again, it's very political, very talky, very much about their thoughts about things. There is action in there, but that's not the focus of this. So I think it's done well, and I think it's intended to be that way, but I would find that you definitely have to be in the mood for that sort of novel. At the end of the day, if that's something you like, if that's the type of novel you like, then I do recommend it. I do think it does that very well. If that doesn't quite sound right, something you might enjoy, this might not be for you, but it is, again, it's enjoyable if you're in the mood for that type of story. If not, you might want to wait for the paperback. Again, this is, I believe, the first in a trilogy, so you may even want to wait for the whole trilogy to be done and then just kind of read it in one go. Just from my reading of the Alphabet Squadron books, I do remember that because there was so much kind of, Alexander Freed writes his characters with so much inner thought and them reacting to situations, and he writes heavy books. This was about over 400 pages. It might also be better to wait for the trilogy to be done as well, because I do remember when I was reading the Alphabet Squadron books, I would forget sometimes what had happened in between them, though that might just be a common problem. But yeah, that's Reign of the Empire. If it feels like if this sounds like something you would enjoy, go for it. But let me know what you thought. Do you enjoy the more kind of political nature of this book and how they explored the characters? If you're an Andor fan and you read this, did you enjoy it? Did it kind of meet your expectations? Let me know. But other than that, may the Force be with you, and I'll see you next time.